From the server side, again, SQL Azure only supports SQL authentication, so there's no integration authentication, and that's right now because there's no such thing as domain in Windows Azure. Now with the IaaS infrastructure, that's changing a little bit, but right now SQL Azure only supports SQL authentication. That admin that we created when we provision our server is, again, much like SA. And same thing, just like on-prem, you're going to connect to master to administrate to manage your create and manage your logins. But because of the logical and physical differences, some of the roles are a little different. So in SQL Azure, you'll see a login manager role and a DB manager role, and these are used to manage security roles for both the logins and the databases. These are server-level security roles to manage logins and databases. But again, from a security standpoint, it is much the same. So I create a login, base that user off on a login, assign that to roles and permissions, and do grants and things like that. So all that is the same. That really doesn't change. Really, the only difference is there are role differences. So like the login manager role, the DB manager role. So you might see some roles from SQL Server that aren't there in SQL Azure, just because of the difference in nature from a platform as a service, right? But again, I can do a create, alter, drop. I can do from a database and permissions and things like that. So all that is the same, right? That doesn't change. So it's just like logins require an associated user account. So logins and roles and all that's still the same. The DBO has full rights, so that user I created, that admin user, it does have full rights to the database. So again, I guess the messaging here is that really a lot of it's the same. The same security really doesn't change. You will add users through the SP add role member to grant privileges, so that might be a little different. So, but you'll notice that logins and users are assigned to roles, and you can do grants and create, alter, drop permissions and grant and all that. So that's the difference. Now, I asked you earlier to remember that checkbox when we provisioned our server, and that's because, again, one of the things that SQL Azure applies is what's called, oh, I passed it, went too far, is the firewall rules, right? So in SQL Azure, you cannot connect to a database until you do a firewall rule, or until you specify your firewall rules. And these are IP address-based rules that say who can connect to this server. And by default, there's no rule, so everything is turned off. And that checkbox, when I asked you to remember that checkbox, so not even any Windows Azure services can connect to SQL Azure until you check that checkbox, right? So it is closed by default. Nobody can get to it. And the way to do this, let me just jump out real fast, is to go into the portal. Let me go back. Let me go back to my yep, I want to leave this page. Let me go back to our portal, and let me go back to our databases once they're provisioned here. And I'm just going to pick a server, and I go to configure. And one of the things I have over here is these are my firewall rules, and these firewall rules basically state who has access to my server. So let's pick one that doesn't have one. Do we have any rules on this one? None. Okay, so I'm going to connect to this server. So let me go back here. I'm going to grab this, right, and I'm going to go to SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to try to connect to this server. Right, so I'm going to say there's the server, and I'm going to try to connect. Right, and this should come back and say no. Don't make a liar out of me. Yep, because my IP address is not. I haven't defined my IP address. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to go to configure. And I love this tool because it tells you what your current IP address is. Right, so I'm going to copy. I'm just going to say test, paste, paste, and it can be arranged, right? I can do something like, 1 to 255, for example, right? But I'm just going to do this one, right? Click save, right? So there's my rule. I can now come back here, click connect, up, 0 to 126. It's making a liar out of me. 0. So let's do 1 to 255. Save. Oh, yeah, there we go. So now we should be able to connect. Right, done. Right. That one, the one IP address should have worked. I don't know. Maybe there's some routing going on in the back end. Right, but again, so you notice that it didn't allow me to get in until I specified an IP address or an IP address range. So it by default locks everything out until I specify who has access. Right. So that's important to know because by default it's very secure. So let's I want to do that over here. So let's go back. Let's continue real quick. I'll take this over here. There we go. All right. So there's the firewall rule. So it basically defines who has access and who doesn't. Now, from the application standpoint, again, nothing really changes. This is your standard connection string works. The only difference is you need to specify your server in the format that we saw, so server.database.windows.net. And then you also need to specify a couple other parameters, trusted connection equals false and encrypt equals true, that because all connections to SQL Azure go over SSL. Everything's over 443, right? So what's awesome is that I won't show this right now until I go back in the portal, but you can actually copy paste connection strings right from the portal into your application and just change the username and password, and you're all ready to go. So they made it very easy. Some considerations and best practices really quick. So again, the login is login at server name. So it'll be like SQL Scott at, and then that part right there, just the server, right? So that's going to be your login name. Idle connections. So Microsoft is going to make sure, again, that everybody plays nice. So idle connections are going to be terminated after 30 minutes. Long-running transactions are going to be automatically terminated after at least 24 hours. If you've got something that's running a long time, it's automatically going to terminate those. But you also want to make sure that it does monitor for denial of service attacks, so it does guard against those things.